Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to my healer tier list for Mythic Plus here in patch 8.2.5. If you're interested in knowing exactly how my tier list works and what the definitions are for each tier, there's a video linked in the description that explains just that. You can also check out my previous tier lists on melee DPS and tanks in Mythic Plus, and there's future ones coming. I'll be doing ranged, and then I'll do a set for raid also. So check those out. Hope you enjoy them. But let's start off with healers. The S tier here is no surprise. I will now spend 10 minutes talking about the reasons why Resto Druid is extremely overpowered in Mythic Plus. Resto Druid is unbelievably good. It's so good for Mythic Plus. I cannot describe, there's a good argument that I should be making like an SS tier and then like an SSS tier and put Resto Druid up above those tiers because it's so good compared to everything else that you could be doing in Mythic Plus. First of all, it's the only Battle Res healer spec available, which is big in and of itself. Battle Res is one of the abilities that works really nicely, especially on your healer. They have Stealth, which facilitates a bunch of skips. It means that they can Stealth plus their Battle Res, Stealth plus just Mass Res is a big combo that allows you to save a bunch of time over having a different healer spec in your group in many dungeons. The natural kit of the Resto Druid's healing is well suited to small numbers of targets. Pre-hotting is also just a good thing to do in Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus features these downtimes between pulls, and Resto Druid is one of the few specs that can do efficient healing before the pull even starts, and then when the pull starts, they can just go into cat form and do a bunch of damage. And they do a bunch of damage. They do a bunch of good single target damage, they do a bunch of good AoE damage. If they don't have to heal, they can do a bunch of effective damage with their cat form damage. If they do have to heal, they can just toss out a couple Sunfires every minute and do so much, the damage per global of those Sunfires in AoE pull is huge. It's amazing. It's amazing how much damage they're bringing just with that. They have a bunch of ways to specialize if they need to be big and tanky. First off, they're just kind of naturally big and tanky. They can just go bear form normally, even if they've spec'd into cat affinity. But if they really need to survive stuff, they can go into bear affinity and just bear form and frenzied regen or whatever. And there are some dungeons where having access to that option is really useful for druids. So they also have Typhoon and Ursul's Vortex and Entangling Roots. These are extremely premium ways to control mobs in packs. They're very effective against just all sorts of pulls. There are, all sorts of pulls and all sorts of affixes also. Soothe is fantastic in some dungeons, and it's also just great against the Raging Affix. That's another effect where it's kind of irreplaceable to have that. It's binary whether or not your group has that. And Resto Druid, it brings basically anytime you have a question about which healer spec does this best, the answer is almost always Resto Druid because the kit just covers basically everything that can happen in Mythic Plus. They also have a taunt. The taunt is not useful in most dungeons, but there are some dungeons where it's very good to have access to a taunt on your healer. There are bosses like Akali the Conqueror, which is one of the 3 bosses in the Council of Tribes in King's Rest. That one, being able to taunt to bounce the boss between your tank and you, is a big thing that the healer can do here. Much better than having a melee DPS taunt and lose some damage. It's also good on Razan. There are ways to make the pursuit not eat the person who is being pursued by taunting it near the end of the pursuit, and Resto Druid is a spec that can do that. They have a Poison Dispel, there's a lot of poison effects in these dungeons. They also have a Curse Dispel. There are not very many curse effects, but the ones that are, it's nice to have a dispel for. So basically, if you think about specific affixes, Resto Druid is a spec that covers all of them. They're just good against Grievous because proactive pre-hotting means that they're pretty easily able to top people up as incoming damage comes out, and they don't have to react and have Grievous start, ticking on them. Quaking is a spec that Resto Druid is very good against because they have a lot of instant casts, so they can both spread easily and move while casting, and they're also not going to get locked out on their cast. They can just keep casting rejuves as the Quake comes out, and they're not going to lose any globals. They have a good proactive healing style that's also effective against bursting. You can just pre-hot everybody before the burst starts, and that's very useful. So, knowing that the damage is coming, the Resto Druid can always prepare for it. Whereas there are some healer specs that can't really do anything useful to prepare for incoming damage, and those have a much harder time against things like bursting. They have a Soothe for raging, and against Necrotic, they have Taunt, Typhoon, Ursul's Vortex, all sorts of effects that will allow them to facilitate their tank dropping stacks. Not to mention just how messed up Typhoon and Vortex are, and their instant cast damage spells against Beguiling. So if there's an Emissary of the Tides, the Resto Druid can just spam Roots against it. If the Emissary of the Tides gets into the pull, the Resto Druid can Typhoon it out so that the group can kick when the Vital Cast is happening. If there's an enchanted emissary, the Resto Druid can just throw some Sunfires and Moonfires at it. They can drop an Ursul's Vortex on where it is, and that will keep it controlled for like 10 seconds. So Beguiling is just a Resto Druid affix as well. In addition to all this utility, their healing on 5 targets is very, very high. Like it's absurd how much throughput they can do with a mastery heavy build on 5 targets. There's basically nobody who will be like, there's no amount of damage that one person can be taking that a Resto Druid cannot heal for if they've prepared for it with HOTS. And their mana efficiency is also insane. They're the most mana efficient healer in most cases. Like the amount of HPS they get per point of mana is very, very high, and they have an innervate for themselves as well in periods of extreme burst. So the the spec it's just absurd. I don't really understand. I don't really understand how it has existed in this form for so long, because it has been basically this absurd for the entire duration of Mythic Plus existing. But yeah, that's the S tier, is Resto Druid. I'm sure I've missed some things that are great about Resto Druid too, and I just, yeah, remind me in the comments what I've missed about this spec. The A tier here I'm going to leave completely empty, because I think that it is not reasonable to place any specs within one tier of Resto Druid as far as healers go. In the B tier, I'm going to put Mistweaver Monk. Mistweaver Monk has been rising in power recently. They have the Conflict and Strife Major Essence, gives them access to Way of the Crane, which is a pretty new dimension for their healing. It lets them do this kind of big burst damage / AoE healing thing, especially if you're playing with a Boomkin. That's a really good combo with your Way of the Crane. That means that you can do it without spending mana during your Innervate there. Boomkin is just kind of in general a good combo with every healer that's not Resto Druid, because it covers some of the utility that Resto brings that people expect from the healer slot. So if you're not a Resto Druid, I think grouping with a Boomkin is a really good idea, because you'll get access to the Battle Res, the Typhoon, the Roots, the Soothe, the Curse Dispel. Well, the Curse Dispel, not important really compared to the other stuff, but you know, those sorts of effects that Resto Druid brings and everybody takes for granted, you're going to get in these spots and keys where people are like, okay, knock, and you just don't have a knock. And that is something that bringing a Balanced Druid will help cover. You'll still have access to all those Druid abilities that people are used to having. Now, as far as knocks go, Mistweaver does have a better knock than Resto Druid. Ring of Peace is an absurdly powerful monk ability, and it's really good against Beguiling as well. There are ways that you can use Ring of Peace to make it so that you choose to pull mobs that you might not otherwise pull. You can pull Tides Emissaries by themselves. You can switch which pull Tides Emissaries come with, and you can pull them with non-difficult pulls instead of with a bunch of casters. Or you can just ring out the Tides Emissary and then not pull the Tides at all and just leave it standing there out of combat. So that's a really useful thing, and it kind of makes up for the fact that Mistweaver doesn't have the Mass Root ability for Tides. Most Tide Emissaries can be handled by Ring of Peace or Mass Root. And so, root spamming, which is something that Resto Druid can do. So Mistweaver has pretty good coverage against that. Mistweaver's kind of toughness, or the drawback that Mistweaver has, is mana efficiency. Mana efficiency is a struggle for Mistweavers. They're going to need to sit and drink a lot. A good Mistweaver can play against this, but and they can sustain very high amounts of healing throughput, but it is extremely intensive on their mana. It can be burst healing. Burst healing is something they're very good at. On-demand burst healing is a cool Mistweaver strength. They also have a Disease Dispel, which can be very good in some dungeons. Underrot is a good example of this. Disease Dispel against the Lashers there, for instance, is pretty big, and it allows you to pull Emissary of the Tides with Lashers and not worry about it, and just cleanse the disease when it goes out. So all in all, a great healer spec. Lots of cool things going for it. It just suffers from the fact that like every strength that any healer spec has, Resto Druid also has that strength. And so it's like you're just choosing what ingredients you want for your pizza, and everybody else gets to pick between 2 toppings, and Resto Druid is just sitting there with like a 30 topping pizza. And, in this world, that's actually tasty and not disgusting. That's my analogy, all right? I'm sticking with it. In the C tier, we have Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin, I think there's a lot of good things going for it. It's a spec that I think will probably climb in the rankings as the expansion goes on, as we moved to the last patch of the tier. There's a lot of exciting things coming for them, maybe next patch that in Mythic Plus. Their Glimmer build is naturally a good build for Mythic Plus. That build is getting nerfed, and the nerf is going to have some effect on Mythic Plus, but not nearly as much as it does in a raid environment. It will still be probably a good playstyle to go with in Mythic Plus. They do very big damage, especially like they can choose to do the most damage, I think, of any of these healer specs in a reasonable way while still doing some healing. They bring in immunity, which can be really useful. Immunity, I think healers are the specs on which immunities are the best, because in periods where there's big damage going out, healers can bubble and they're safe. Like, okay, so Holy Paladin can bubble. They're not going to take any damage, and they are safe to stand still and heal everybody else. Ways that healers can get in trouble is there's big damage coming out, and they need to both survive, heal everybody, and move from whatever swirly is beneath their feet. And there's often a spot where healers can't do all three of those, but Holy Paladins are able to do that by pressing their bubble button. So that's a really useful thing that no other healer spec gets. They also have Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom. Those are useful in some spots. Blessing of Protection if against Necrotic. You can set your tank up with a Cancel Aura macro. So /Cancel Aura, Blessing of Protection. And then you put the Blessing of Protection on them, they immediately cancel it, and it clears all their Necrotic stacks. And make sure they're just spamming that button so that nobody else dies from all the mobs turning around and hitting them. All right, in the D tier, we have Restoration Shaman. Restoration Shaman has some cool things going for it. Their single target damage is pretty good, and they're a spec like Resto Druid that can do good damage. So like they're by spending a few globals per minute on Flame Shocks and Lava Bursts, they do pretty good single target damage, and they can use their other globals to heal effectively. But they don't do any AoE damage, which all these other healer specs have ways to do good AoE damage. Like Resto Shaman Chain Lightning is capped at 3 targets, so above 3 targets, they have no way to do extra damage. They have a kick, which can be useful. That can facilitate you playing a weird comp. Like if you want to play Shadow Priest Fire Mage or something in the same comp, Resto Shaman is a way to add an extra kick that's on a short cooldown to your group's composition, and that can be useful. Although those kind of comps are a little weird, there are other abilities that might be problems for those comps, and Resto Shaman has a pretty hard time healing multi-ranged comps as well, because that makes their chain heals and healing rains less effective, and those are some of their bigger ways to get throughput. They've been buffed twice recently, both of which were helpful buffs, both of which help their single target healing. But one problem that Resto Shaman has relative to these 3 specs above them is that they don't have an external cooldown that they can put on the tank. The closest thing they have to an external is Spirit Link Totem, which is good, but it's on a very long cooldown. And every other spec has like Iron Bark, Life Cocoon, Blessing of Sacrifice, and those are not something that Resto Shaman can do. So if a tank is panicking and about to die, a Resto Shaman can only really save them with Link, and that's a lot of a sketchier proposition than the other abilities, because you need other people to be in melee immediately, and you need the rest of the group to have some health to share with the tank. And you can only do it once every 3 minutes instead of once every 45 seconds or whatever ridiculous cooldown Resto Druids have on that ability, Iron Bark. Ankh is a cool and useful ability that Shaman get. Basically, Ankh lets them once every 30 minutes by dying and giving up 5 seconds on the death timer, plus however long it takes to res everybody and stuff. So by paying that cost, once every 30 minutes, they can do what a Resto Druid can do with stealth for skips. So that's a cool little thing that they can do. One problem they have also is that many of their abilities don't really scale down to the 5 target number very well. Healing Tide Totem, for instance, loses a bunch of value against just 5 targets, whereas that's a phenomenal ability in Raid. So it's kind of got a reverse Resto Druid problem where much of their kit is great in a 20-person raid, because like Chain Heal is very likely to find 5 targets that need to be healed or whatever, and that's less true in a Mythic Plus environment. They do have some other cool pieces of utility. Earth Elemental is strong. It's the weaker version of Earth Elemental. It's not the Elemental Shaman version of Earth Elemental. So it's not directly controllable by the Shaman, which can get you into trouble in some spots. You can't move it, for instance, and it will just attack whatever you target. So you can't like Earth Elemental and knock back an Enchanted Emissary at the same time, because your Earth Elemental will pull the entire pack into the Enchanted Emissary's aura as it chases the Enchanted Emissary, because that's what you're targeting. So that's a little bit of a drawback with the Earth Elemental that Resto Shaman brings compared to the one that Elemental Shaman brings. Resto Shaman also brings an offensive purge, which is useful in some spots too. And they have a Curse Dispel, which, probably the weakest of the types of Dispel that not all healers get, because of course every healer can Dispel magic. The next spec on this tier list is Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest is really a reverse Resto Druid in terms of how its kit scales. Much like Resto Shaman, their abilities just don't work very well with 5 targets. Discipline Priest can apply atonements to people, and atonement is a very potent like healing over time effect, basically, that they put on players that lets them then heal that person whenever they do damage. But they can't apply more than one atonement per person. So once they've applied their 5 atonements, they don't really have... They're not like Resto Druids where it's like, okay, I can put like 7 hots on each person. Discipline Priest can only really do one big thing for each person with atonement. And then past that, they are stuck Shadow Mending to heal people directly. And that is pretty bad compared to what the other healers get to do. So their spot healing is not great. They have some good cooldowns. Pain Suppression and Barrier are both fantastic because they're damage reduction cooldowns and very big damage reductions, and that scales really nicely with increased key level. They also do damage even on fights where there's not time to find damage globals, basically, because damage is the way that they heal. So against like tough tyrannical encounters, they are likely to shorten the fight because they're also adding their damage even while healing the whole group. But they have a tough throughput time these days. Just a tough time making enough throughput to keep the group alive, especially against affixes like Grievous. They have a tough time out healing Grievous on the group, and then when there's other damage coming at the same time, it gets really bad. So that affix in particular, very, very tough for Discipline Priest. You really should try to bring specs like Balance Druid, Ret Paladin, specs that are off healing specs, or specs like Havoc Demon Hunter that don't require too much external healing if you're choosing to play a Discipline Priest in those weeks. All right, the final spec on the list here is Holy Priest. Holy Priest really doesn't, like, it's not like it's awful at healing, it just really doesn't bring anything to the group in the way that these other specs do. It doesn't bring, big crowd control options. It doesn't bring absurd numbers. The Guardian Spirit defensive cooldown is one of the weaker ones. It's, it gives somebody a cheat death, but it doesn't really reduce their incoming damage taken. So it's one of the weaker tank cooldowns that is available. It doesn't scale very well into high keys. But yeah, so there's basically just nothing... Like, again, it's a spec you can play, and you can heal keys, and they have buttons that heal people, and they will be able to do that. But you will need the other 4 members of your group to cover all the utility that you need to find in the dungeon. And that's the reason they're down here in the F tier. It's not that you can't play them, it's just that they are not bringing a full, specs worth of utility to the table compared to, how I spent 30 minutes talking about all the things Resto Druid can do. Holy really doesn't have anything in that list. There's a couple of small niche things they have that are useful, but nothing like no. I think you would trade all of Holy's utility for like Entangling Roots if you could. That alone would be enough. Would be worth more than like Mass Dispel plus Life Grip plus the Offensive Purge, all put together. So yeah, it's tough times. It's tough times for Priest here. We have both the Priest specs down here in the bottom 2 tiers. So difficult time, and healer balance in general. I think healers are the role that have been worst balanced for longest in Mythic Plus. I think tanks, melee, and ranged have had times where their balance has been bad, but Blizzard has been pretty quick to fix those. Resto Druid has been up here in the S or A tier since Mythic Plus started, and there's just no sign of that changing anytime in the near future. It seems like Blizzard just doesn't want to redesign the kits or adjust how abilities work in Mythic Plus at all, or move some strength around to abilities that are predominantly useful in Raid, take some value off the Mastery stat, for instance, for Resto Druids. Blizzard doesn't have any kind of... It doesn't seem like this is a priority for them. So I would definitely advise, if you're a healer playing Mythic Plus and you're struggling and you're playing one of these lower specs, I would advise trying out Resto Druid because it's just unreal how much better it is than the other options. And if Blizzard is watching this, I would advise nerfing Resto Druid. That would be my main thing. I think if I could change one spec in Mythic Plus, it would be Resto Druid. I think that Resto Druid oppresses all 5 of these other specs, all of which have cool and awesome things that I would like to see more of in Mythic Plus, and it's so difficult to justify bringing anything that is not a Resto Druid. So thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.